Welcome to the Friends with Money podcast, brought to you by Money Magazine, creating financial freedom for Australians since 1999.
Hello and thanks for joining us for another episode of Friends with Money, Money Magazine's podcast to help you earn, save and achieve your financial goals. My name is Tom Watson, a senior journalist here at Money Magazine, and as always, it is a pleasure to be with you. Last month, I got our quarterly electricity and gas bills. Now, I will say that I was expecting both to be pretty large because we've been running the heating a fair bit to combat the icy Canberra winter, but I wasn't expecting to be hit with a $1,200 gas bill and a $700 electricity bill. To be honest, I was shocked and pretty frustrated, and I've no doubt that there are plenty of other people listening and elsewhere in Australia who've had a very similar experience with their energy bills in recent weeks and years, I guess. Energy, as you've no doubt realized, dear listener, is at the very heart of our conversation today because we are going to be talking all about electrification and the opportunities it can present for Australian households. And I really can't think of anyone better to be joining us to talk about that subject today than today's guest, Saul Griffith. Saul is an engineer, an inventor, the founder of Rewiring Australia, and the author of several books, including his latest, plug-in, the Electrification Handbook. Now, I'm sure I've missed a couple of titles and accomplishments in there, but that'll have to do for now because it's about time I said hello. So, Saul, hello. It is a very great pleasure to have you on Friends with Money.
Good morning, Tom, and thanks for having me.
You are so welcome. Let's dive into things, Saul. But before I get into kind of electrification more generally, you've written The Big Switch before, amongst other work. So what made you want to, I guess, get your typewriter or your laptop back out again and write plug-in the Electrifying Handbook?
So it's actually the fourth book I've written on electrification, and it was at the request of the publisher. The first book I wrote, Electrify, was sort of written for the incoming American president in 2020, and that was sort of the theory of why electrification is our solution for climate change. It also involved some of the economics but it was the hypothetical. If this, and this become true in terms of electric vehicles and solar and other technologies, what does that mean? The Big Switch was a little bit less theoretical and more for, thought leaders and people who read books. That was also a little bit theoretical and not quite happening. Then I wrote the quarterly essay, The Wires That Bind, which was sort of about the macroeconomics for communities and what's in it for communities if we get through this energy transition correctly. And the publisher came back and said, all those are good, but what we want, it seems like the rubber can now hit the road for this electrification, this climate action. Can you write us a how-to book, like a DIY handbook or step-by-step instructions on how you'd get it done? And I thought that was a great idea because I think you could say the climate movement talks a little bit too much to itself and not enough to the average punter. And so this was a nice challenge to talk to real people on the ground about the now real benefits. It was a hypothetical 5 years ago. Now we were right. The economics are in place. The batteries got cheaper. The cars got cheaper. The solar got cheaper again. And so this is about how to get all of these hooked up in your home, how to wire them into the grid, how to select your retail electricity plan, and how to do three things at once: smash your energy bills, improve the health of everyone in your family, and meet our climate goals.
Well, it seems like you've been kind of narrowing in. And if you need a fifth idea for a book and you want to come to my house and look at my home in particular, you'd be very welcome to do that. You put you up in Canberra. It's lovely down here.
The next book will be an individualized wiring diagram for every home in Australia.
Sounds good. All right, so big question up top. Why should households consider electrification? What are the opportunities? And perhaps even before we get into those, can you give us a really brief summary of what the term electrification actually means?
Electrification broadly means cancelling your subscription to petrol and diesel, cancelling your subscription to natural gas, and getting all of your energy services from one source, and that source being electricity. One of the opening chapters of the book, I think I talked to a friend of mine called Chris Kerr, and I think that chapter really speaks to the why. You can do this for a host of reasons. He started off his electrification journey because he wanted to get the return on the investment. Like you, he got a $1,500 electricity bill. He said, screw that. I want to fix that. He bought his solar. Then he realized he had way more solar than he needed. So then he electrified the water heater. Then he electrified the heating system for the house. Then he bought an electric car. Then he even bought an electric heater for his swimming pool and spa. And he's now all electric, and the return on investment is great. He is a bit of an engineer type mentality, so he over-optimized his electrification process. Maybe he set the dials a little too tightly around when the water is going to be hot in the home. His wife had a cold shower. That nearly ruined the entire exercise. And in his words, that's when he realized that return on comfort is a very important aspect of this. So as you do this, can you make your home more comfortable? He lives in a family of 6, 4 kids, and they now are living a much more comfortable life, including all of the energy savings and enabled them to add a fairly luxurious spa to their life, and they had enough solar to feed it. Then he also describes that with his kids, they weren't really in it for the return on investment, nor really for the return on comfort. They're modern kids. They know that climate change is real. They are demanding the return on environment. So I really liked his story and his journey. Everyone will take a different journey on getting all those things electrified. It's going to take the country 20 to 30 years to get the job done. So I think this is an antidote to panic, climate change. This is, okay, panic, climate change is real. Now all you have to do is make 5 or 6 good decisions in the next 20 years and you're going to solve the problem. And he did that, and every constituent in his family, whether they care about the planet, whether they care about comfort, whether they care about money, has been satisfied by this process of household electrification.
It's a great way to sum it up. And you gave me the perfect segue to get into the next point, which is, you've already touched on in Chris's example in terms of what he did. But what are the kind of the big 5 areas that you talk about in your book that households can really kind of focus on when it comes to electrification?
I mean, the 5 big important things are pretty simple. It's how you heat your water, how you heat the home, how you cook your food, how you drive your vehicle, and what other transportation things you have in your house. And then the 5th one is where you buy your electricity from and whether some of that is from solar and whether you store it in a battery. So where you get your electricity from, your car, your water heat, your space heat, and your cooking. If you make those 5 decisions well, you'll have no more fossil fuels in your house and you'll lower your energy bills in Australia. In fact, Chris believes he's saving $5,000 or $6,000 a year. Another character in the book is saving about $8,000 or $9,000 a year. So, depending upon the size of your family and how you use energy, this can be a significant economic win.
Again, as someone who's just been hit with a pretty monster electricity bill, I can see the kind of appeal of that and the appeal of, saving on that money. I mean, it just irks me that I have to pay a company that much money every quarter to heat my home and to do all those other bits you said. Obviously, there's an upfront cost to electrification, though, right? So and that's going to differ from household to household, depending on, which of those 5 areas they're looking to address and change, whether it's all of them or some of them, and I guess the individual products that they use within that. But are you able to give us like a ballpark figure of any kind in terms of how much electrification can cost or what households are looking at to go through that process?
I'm always nervous about saying the word cost because you can make it sound scary, a couple of grand for a water heater, another $5,000 for getting all the heating systems, $10,000 for a giant solar system, $10,000 for a battery, and then pick your poison with a car. You can get a $30,000 BYD, you can get a $100,000 Audi or Volkswagen. And if you added all of those up, it would be a fairly scary sounding $130,000, $140,000, depending upon how many cars and what cars. The reality is, though, you don't really think you're already spending money doing those things. You've already got a water heater in your basement that needs replacing every 10 years. You've already got a heating system in your home that needs replacing every 15 years. You've already got a car that gets replaced every 20 years, and you may or may not have the solar and the battery. So it is a substantial barrier to a lot of people, the upfront immediate cost. We now know that for every one of those appliances and vehicles, over the period that you owe them, if you can think over the 10 years that water heater is strapped to the side of your house or in your basement, they will all save you money. So the reason I'm nervous about saying it's cost you, it's a high number, but it isn't really what's happening. If you have access to finance, so you finance these on your mortgage or use one of the government incentivized lower interest loans for doing these green things, then it might cost a lot up front, but actually your week to week cash flow improves because you're saving money week to week on your energy bills. And over the lifetime of the vehicles and the products, you'll save a whole bunch of money.
Yeah, so it's not about necessarily racing out and feeling like you're compelled to do all these things at once even. It's the idea that you've got these things, you'd replace them anyway, but when you do, it might be in your best interest financially for the environment, whatever reason it is, to electrify these products rather than replace them with whatever existing infrastructure that you've got.
It's an awful dad pun, but I'm a dad and I'm awful. So I like to say, when it dies, electrify.
Nice and simple.
Exactly.
So moving on, one small section of the book that really caught my attention, probably because I hadn't actually read much about it before, was on HEMS or home energy management systems. So could you maybe briefly explain to us what those are about and how they can help someone who's actually already electrified?
So this is the least mature of all the things. All the things we mentioned, those big five things, they're all mature products, lots of choice in the marketplace. The final thing is they all need to plug into what's called a home energy management system. That needs to tell the battery when to charge, tell the car how much charge it should be taking, so it's not overwhelming the circuits in your home. So it's like the brain of the whole system. There's a lot of companies now producing these HEMS, but at your last step, you got everything. You need to coordinate and program that system. And this is something that there were a lot of advanced nerds in my book. They tend to do it themselves. One of the characters in the book, in fact, wrote his own HEMS. But, there are now systems, big names like Tesla, Schneider, others make them, and they have apps that are accessible on your phone. And a lot of tradies can actually program it for you when they do these installations and hand you your phone and the thing that controls your heating system and when the battery gets charged and discharged. In some cases, some of that HEMS function is taken over by a third party. Like if you subscribe your battery to Amber Electric, they take control of your battery for you and they give you money back as they help you use your battery to arbitrage the electricity in the grid. So it is an important component of that last HEMS. The one solution to rule them all has not emerged. There's a bunch in the marketplace. There are various levels of easier and harder to use. It's probably we're doing these pilots in the Illawarra, and it's the thing that's the most confusing and a little bit frustrating for the homeowner at the end of the journey. But it's getting better every month at this point, the technology. And it is critical if you're going to have the whole house work, reliably give you your hot water on time and everything else and optimize the money savings for you.
As I said, I'd never really come across them before. And so I thought it was such an interesting point, and it makes complete sense to me, even as someone who hasn't electrified their house yet. So interesting to hear about.
And you can imagine heuristically, it's pretty simple. When the sun is shining, pour the battery into the car, pour the electricity in the car, pour the electricity into the battery. When the sun is not shining, use those batteries to power the house. When the price of electricity on the grid is high, sell your battery into the grid. When the price on the electricity on the grid is low, pour it back into your battery. It's just making those fairly simple decisions. The future will be set and forget. I think these things are a little overemphasized right now because they're new and necessary, but I believe the marketplace will figure out how to make this painless for the consumer, and you'll set it once when you set up the water heater, and then it's just programmed and running well for the rest of its life.
As a lazy man, that sounds like music to my ears. So looking forward to the day when that happens. So you acknowledge in your book that electrification can be more difficult for some people. I think that's reality. Even if they'd be dead keen on doing it, you mentioned renters, you mentioned people who live in strata complexes, or on the EV front specifically, people who don't have access to off-street parking. I think at various times in my life, I could probably tick off all three of those. So is there anything that people in these positions can do who are keen on electrification?
It is harder, but it is getting easier. finally, I think people are realizing that this is very important to get right. If we don't get it right, there's going to be a social license pushback because it's going to feel like the rich people get the nice, clean electric toys and the poor people don't. So I think it cuts to the core of what it is to be Australian. Do we want a fair Australia where everyone gets a shot, or do we not? I think that has moved the political needle on these issues. We're starting to see good policy and good regulations. Victoria is sort of leading the way on this. Legislation that compels the landlord to put on solar on the roof to lower the bills for the renter if the renter requests. There's no reason to refuse that unless there's some technical reason. There's things like the battery subsidies that help poorer people afford the thing that's got a high upfront ticket price. That's good federal policy. And there's technologies that are helping solve the strata problem. The strata problem probably needs regulation. There's always one grumpy old climate denier on the board that's going to say, yeah, no, mate, not over my dead body. And then there's some things are just going to take time. There's no way that we get to the future without a huge profusion of public vehicle charging stations that are easy to access, even ones that are street side on your street. That is starting to happen slowly. Those things are important. So some of these things will just take time. Some of them need you to get, what do you do if you're in this situation? You get angry and you go talk to your politicians and you raise hell, and then you'll help put pressure on and make this happen. So some of this is part of the reason for writing the book is, we're building the army to make these demands of our political economy.
So we've covered a ton today already, but before we let you go, is there any, single final takeaway or piece of advice that you'd like to leave our listeners with on the subject of electrification or tattoos or whatever it is, spas?
Given the title and subject of your podcast, this is people who think about money and economics. We did some modeling last year that suggests that if Australia adopted this electrification as fast as we could. What do I mean by that? The next time anyone in the country's water heater goes, it's replaced with an electric one. Same for the car, same for all things. The country would save about $1.7 trillion, I think, with our number by 2050.
Wow.
So we've gone through the economic tipping point around this, is what we have called it, the economic tipping point. Like, for nearly everyone in every circumstance anywhere in the country, doing this is in the economic interest, not only of the individual, but of the community, of the nation. Here's an extraordinary opportunity for Australia to become more economically efficient. This is classic productivity. Do less with more, right? When you put this electrification in, you lower the total amount of primary energy the country needs, you increase the comfort, you lower the cost. It's a win-win-win-win-win everywhere. I think that's important to emphasize because there is still so much misinformation pushed by the gas industry, pushed by the fossil fuel industry, and it's all bunkum. Like, this is in your interests, it's in the country's interest, it's just time for Australia to get on with it. I think that's kind of good news. We've sort of been a climate criminal. We're one of the biggest fossil producers in the world. So it's nice that actually Australia gets to lead the world finally, not in dragging its feet on climate, but in making it real. And that's a pretty exciting thing to me, to think that if the market were free or if we behaved like economics mattered, we would be doing this as fast as possible because it's just cash in the bank.
Cash in the bank. Great note to end it. I ended on today. I will say, having spent the last week reading Plug In, your book on the bus to and from work, I've got to say that's an immensely practical read and totally understandable. Even for someone like me who didn't even know what kind of water heater he owned, or even where it was located before reading the book, and now I do. So for that alone, thank you, Saul. It's been a real pleasure having you on, so many thanks for joining us today.
All right. Cheers, mate.
That's it for this episode of the Friends with Money podcast, but don't forget to jump on our website, moneymag.com.au, for your daily dose of financial news, or you can go grab yourself a copy of the latest edition of Money Magazine in all good newsagents. As always, Friends with Money will be right back in your podcast feed next week, so until then, my name is Tom Watson. Goodbye for now.
Thanks for listening to the Friends with Money podcast. For credible, independent, and easy to understand financial commentary, visit moneymag.com.au. Please remember that the views and opinions expressed in this podcast are general in nature, and further independent advice and research based on your personal circumstances should be sought before making an investment decision.